Thank you so much for having me back. I've been having a really great time at the conference so far. Thank you so much to Ryan for putting all of this together. I'm going to read to you from my young adult novel, which is a cool, weird thing that I get to do now. So it's called A Study in Charlotte, and it is a retelling of sorts of the Holmes and Watson mysteries. So in this we have a girl, Sherlock Holmes, her name is Charlotte, a boy, Watson, his name is Jamie, and he's narrating. And the two of them are being framed for murder at their American boarding school. And I think the only thing you need to know is that in these books, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were real, and these are their great, what have you, grandchildren. Their school is called Sherringford. Sherringford had released a statement referring to Lee Dobson's death as an accident with a snake, which came off much more bizarre than terrifying. It was their attempt to reassure parents that our campus was safe, but students were still being dragged home in droves. Our hall, in particular, had an emptied-out feeling to it. For 2 days running, there was no line for the shower, no music blaring from behind closed doors. Into that silence, the reporters appeared. One day they weren't there. The next, everywhere, crawling all over the quad with their cameras and flashbulbs and strident voices. They lay in wait after our classes, putting sympathetic hands on our shoulders and pointing the lenses into our faces. Most of the students ignored them. Some didn't. One day during lunch, I watched the red-headed girl from my French class crying delicately into a camera. Her headshots, she sobbed, were on her website if they needed them. I guess I couldn't blame her for using the press. The press were using her too. The same reporter took a particular shine to me, following me from class to class, murmuring words of sympathy before launching into questions like, do you really think Lee Dobson's death was an accident? And is it true that you keep a snake in your dorm room? From the logo on the cameraman's kit, I knew that they were from the BBC. I would have known it anyway from the reporter's plummy accent and haughty chin, the very image of some grown-up Oxford wanker. He'd been sent across the pond to try to get some dirt on the Holmeses. I was sure by the way he kept turning the conversation back to Charlotte. Somehow he'd gotten hold of my class schedule, and for days he waited for me between classes, his cameraman always towering behind him. The worst was the afternoon I thought I'd gotten away clean. The two of them were talking to a townie on the Sciences building steps as I came out through the front door. Yeah, man, he was telling them, I've heard the stories too. I have a lot of friends who say that Charlotte Holmes is the head of this messed up cult and James Watson is like her angry little henchman. I hurried past them, head down, but the reporter charged after me, calling my name, reaching out to pull on my arm. I whipped around, ready to deck him. The cameraman stepped forward eagerly, training his lens on my face. See what I mean? The townie said. I got a good look at him this time. He was around 30 years old, with mean little features and thick blonde hair. My roommate had pointed him out to me as the campus drug dealer. I'd seen him lurking around at night. Apparently, these days, he had more credibility than I did. Back off, I said quietly, and put my collar up. They let me walk on alone, but we all knew they'd be back the next day. Except they weren't. Evidently, the reporters bothered enough of us that the parents had begun to complain. Sherringford officially closed our campus to the public. When I asked Holmes if she was relieved, she smiled politely. My brother has an arrangement with the press, she said. They've never bothered me. Morale was low, and so it wasn't a surprise that the school decided to go ahead with our homecoming weekend despite all the commotion. Our school's green and white banners streamed from the chapel and the library. The dining hall announced they would be serving salmon and steak for dinner. And the days leading up to the dance, girls walked in droves to town and returned with long dresses and tied-off plastic bags. They'd ordered them months before, from New York and Boston, and one even from Paris. That was according to Cassidy and Ashton, who gossiped relentlessly through every one of our French classes. But it wasn't just girls who were preening in preparation. My roommate Tom was taking Lena, and he must have had his parents ship his suit from Chicago. I have no idea how else he'd get his hands on a powder blue jacket and vest. It might have been a waste of time and money, but for once I understood it. Better to focus on pageantry than death. When I told Holmes that, she threw her head back in one of her rare laughs. For a boy, you are massively melodramatic, she said. I couldn't really argue with that. She had plenty of data to draw from because I spent every spare moment I had in Sciences 442, her lab. We had lunch there and dinner, or rather, I ate in the ravenous way I always did, where she made a series of deductions about my day. "You had Captain Crunch for breakfast," she'd say, "and you tried a new shaving cream you don't like," the whole while pushing her food around her plate to disguise the fact that she wasn't eating. I bothered her about that, the way she picked at her food, and she'd eat a fry or two to appease me. 10 minutes later, I'd bother her some more. One night, I mentioned that my favorite song was Nirvana's Heart-Shaped Box, and an hour later, messing around on her violin, she played the opening measures of Smells Like Teen Spirit. I don't think she realized she'd been doing it. When she caught my gaze, she jumped about a foot and slid directly into Bach's Allemande. I learned the names of everything she played. She liked when I asked, and I liked to listen. The way we were with each other wouldn't have made sense to anyone else, even if I tried to explain it. I had a habit of volleying any ridiculous statement she'd make back over the net with topspin, and we'd ramp ourselves up into fierce arguments that way about Beatles and Christmas plays and the color of Dr. Watson's eyes. We bickered over possible suspects. She was sure our murderer had a Sherringford association, but I couldn't imagine why he or she wouldn't have acted the year before. I still couldn't imagine why I would be a target. When I found a nest of prescription bottles hidden in her violin case, we had a pitched battle over the fact that she was still using Oxy. "It's none of your business," she said, furious, and grew even angrier when I insisted that, in fact, it was. How could it not be? I was her friend. Maybe that's why the worst rows we had were about nothing at all. After we had it out one night about the way she always sprawled out on the love seat, leaving me to sit on the floor, I stormed from the lab to find, the next morning, that she'd brought in a folding chair. "For you," she said, with an idle gesture. It was all we really had room for in that small space. But we didn't always egg each other on like that. More often, it was the opposite. Instead of yelling at her, I'd find myself sucked in by her hypnotic stare and unrelenting train of logical thought until I was letting her do something like pluck out my nose hair for an experiment. To be fair, she did promise to do my chemistry homework for a month in exchange. She taught me how to pick a basic lock, and after I'd finally maneuvered my pins into the right position and heard the telltale click and fallen back against the love seat in relief, she put a blindfold over my eyes and made me do it again. Later, after Holmes said she hadn't been allowed any when she was little, I bought a full-to-bursting bag of bulk candy from the Union store and set it before her like an offering to a king. Deep in thought, she'd refused to try any of it, rolling her eyes at the very suggestion. When I returned from stepping out to take a call from my mother, I found her trying, very unsuccessfully, to bite into an everlasting gobstopper. With all my time spent in Sciences 442, the outside world grew more and more strange. Sometimes, spending a day in Holmes's lab made it feel like it was a bunker we'd stocked against a nuclear apocalypse and moved into before it happened. When Tom texted to ask who I was taking to the dance, I found myself blinking hard in the lab's dim light, trying to remind myself that I could actually emerge from the unirradiated world and go. But I didn't have a date, and told myself I didn't want one. When I thought about the dance, I kept imagining it taking place in some other Sherringford. When we're spending an evening with the most fascinating girl I knew meant disco balls and shitty music, not Bunsen burners and bloodstains. When we're going out into a sea of my classmates would be something rather than absolute torture. There was no way to forget I was a murder suspect when people I didn't know still stopped talking every time I walked into a classroom. Because the truth of it was that I was terrified. I kept expecting to wake up dead. Someone out there had it in for Holmes and me, and we had no idea who it was. More accurately, I had no idea who it was. I had the sinking feeling that Holmes did, but she sat on her suspicions with the smug languor of a cat on a pillow. "I refuse to theorize in advance of the facts," was her response. "So then let's go get some facts," I said. "Where do we begin?" Thank you.
Yeah.